Color has the power to move us. It can tell a story about time, place. It can help send us into another world, another realm. It can be something of fantasy or reality. Color really has the power to change an entire mood of a scene. From something more dreary to something brilliant and vivid and wild and magical. In my paintings, I never think about color independently from light moving in the landscape. And not because we only see color because of light. As artists, we need those things to help tell our story. Luckily, we are the inventors of our own reality, and depending on what colors and what lighting we use in our scenes, we can move the audience in different ways. My own color journey starts back in 2015. Actually, no, it goes much further back than that. I used to use art as therapy, and I still kind of do, but I used to do lots of abstract paintings that were just purely about color. And in doing that, I was exploring my own aesthetic and also just getting a feel for painting. My whole life I've been interested in fantasy and science fiction. Yep, I'm one of them. And I think the aesthetic from those genres really played a part in how I developed my art. So in 2015, when I really started to focus on painting, I realized that it was like having a magical power. If I could control light and color on the paper, I could send my viewer into this magical world of fiction, something that I completely created out of my own mind. And as time went on, my interest in bridging my love for painting and nature grew even stronger, and I found myself gravitating towards landscapes. But I still held on to that fantasy feeling in my paintings. And that includes the creative use of color. So maybe using an interesting choice of shadow or highlight here and there, or just changing out one or two colors in a landscape to something really wild and seeing what happens. And that's the important thing, experimentation. The draw towards realism is pretty addictive, and you can get a lot of praise when you get really good at painting something realistically. But what happens when you let go of all your preconceived notions about what something should look like and paint what you want it to look like? In my experience, it opens so many new doors of creativity. Okay, so if you're new to painting, how do you start down this path of creative use of color? I wish I could go back in time. It would have been so much easier if I had done what I'm about to tell you guys. Before you ever start painting a landscape or a person, whatever it is you're interested in painting, do color mixing charts. I talk about this all the time now because it's so incredibly valuable. When you first buy your paint, you have no idea what colors you can create with it. Knowledge is power, and the more you get to know your colors, the better you are going to be at choosing them when it comes time to paint something. And of course, our understanding of color and how it works in a landscape or any kind of scene is something that doesn't happen overnight. It develops over time. And in my case, a lot of repetition. And starting out with that little bit of knowledge is going to get you much further, much quicker. I know it's so tempting to jump straight into painting landscapes because that's what I did when I started. But jumping in blindfolded is going to lead to frustration. Of course, you can get there in the end either way. I did, and so can you. And once you get to that point, you have so much more to learn. So along the way, we just have to enjoy the journey. I recently asked you guys for your questions about, well, anything. So I figured this would be a great time to answer some of those questions and show you some examples. This is probably one of my most asked questions about color. But there is a problem with this question. just by asking this question, I'm assuming that you are stuck in the mindset of I need to copy what I see, and you haven't experimented or played enough and just tried things, because that's literally how I got to the point that I'm at now with my art, just trying things. And I can't stress this enough, how important it is to be playful with your art. Having that sense of play is going to be so beneficial, and you will grow so much faster than if you get really stuck on the technicalities of everything. So let's do some playing right now. This is a really great warm-up, even if you are a seasoned painter or you are a realistic painter and want to transition into being more creative with your colors. First, you need to find a reference photo, and we're going to turn our reference photo into black and white. It will help to find a photo that has high contrast, so if you turn it to black and white, you can see lots of brights and lots of darks. I'll use Photoshop to demonstrate how I usually do this in my head, because we're going to make our own colors. We're going to assign a highlight color and a shadow color. And everywhere you see brightness in your photo, that's going to be your highlight color. Everywhere you see darkness, that will be your shadow color. Pretty straightforward. So go ahead and desaturate your reference photo. And then if you need to, you can also adjust the levels, and this will increase the brightness or increase the darkness depending on what you need to do. The first thing we'll do is make a new layer. And then in the layer properties, we're going to select darker color. Now grab a fun color and start painting over it. You'll quickly see that the color fills in everywhere except the darker color. And then we'll make a new layer, and we'll choose a color that stands out a lot from this first color. It's really fun to play with complementary colors in this exercise, but you can choose anything you want. Fill in the layer, and then in the layer properties, select soft light. And you see this color has been applied to the darker areas of the reference photo. You can have fun and try different colors and play with different combinations. And once you find a color combination that you are interested in, you can then set up to paint. Now, you don't have to go through this whole tedious process every time you want to paint with creative colors. This is just meant to get you started thinking about how to apply creative colors to different parts of a reference photo. And of course, you don't have to go this extreme to be able to use creative colors in your landscapes. This is just an exercise. And the more you do it, the more it becomes intuitive, and you'll be able to do this on the fly. I've done this many, many times over the years, and it always pushes me outside my comfort zone and gets me thinking about color and light a little bit differently. And the cool thing is that you can easily apply this to anything that you like to paint, whether it's portraits, animals, landscapes, whatever. Just have fun with it. If you want to listen to me talk through this and see the whole process from start to finish, I put a link in the description to the bonus tutorial over on Patreon. But for now, we're going to move on to the next question. This is another really commonly asked question, and I definitely understand why, because once you change one thing in a scene, the rest of the stuff kind of has to go along with it. And I do this all the time in my painting, but I actually never really explained it until now. First of all, I'll throw this out there, and it's probably going to annoy some people, but this has so much to do with frequent observation, and it definitely requires repetition. So yeah, I'm sorry. It's one of those things where I'm just saying, you gotta go practice. But seriously, it's so important to constantly observe from nature, from life, if you ever want to get good at this. The more often you view different types of lighting in person, the more you become sensitive to the changes that happen. So when you sit down to paint and you have a reference photo that maybe isn't super bright and vivid or has dull colors, but you want to make a really interesting, vivid painting from it, you can recall those memories of when you were outside and you saw the beautiful waves and you saw the blue sky with the bright clouds and all of that fun stuff, and you can apply that. You can simply take what you need from the reference photo, like the composition or the forms, and apply your own knowledge about color and light. And once again, this comes with practice, it comes with observation over time, and you'll definitely get there. But I'll show you how I practice this and how I turn a kind of dull or less interesting photo into something that I think is a much better painting. I'll use this photo as an example because this is something I do quite often with my coastal scenes. And this time we don't really have to worry about using a super limited palette, although I do recommend using a limited palette of maybe 3 to 5 colors when you're beginning, because it takes away a lot of the complication that can happen from having way too many colors in front of you. You really only need your primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, plus white. And I'll show you how I use a relatively limited palette here using these colors with white. And I'm not going to use black or anything like that. Instead, I'm going to play with a pinkish purple tone as my shadow color. Okay, now this is something that happens quite a lot when I go out and paint. I leave my house, it's nice and sunny, and by the time I get to my spot and set up, the clouds have moved in. And instead of seeing brilliant blues and greens in the water, I have much more muted tones to work with. The rocks themselves are also really dark and more muted, and they're reflecting that pale color of the sky. And there's no problem with painting muted colors. In fact, it can be really beautiful, and I often enjoy doing that. But sometimes I just really wanted to practice with bright colors. Or I just wanted to have the beautiful ambiance of being out in nature, listening to the waves while I painted something that was in my mind. So in this case, I'm here with the waves and I'm painting a coastal scene. I can often look up and observe the crashing of the waves against the rocks. I can look at the shapes of the rocks and sometimes the shadows or the highlights, but I'm going to apply my own colors to them. So automatically I'm going to reach for my more vivid tones like my cobalt turquoise light, my primary blue, my permanent alizarin crimson, and just play with those brighter colors and see how I can apply them in different areas. From past experiences, I know that oftentimes the sky is a brighter, warmer blue, so I can use primary blue really easily and represent that. And then the water itself shifts down to a cooler blue, so I'll go for an ultramarine. And as it gets closer to the shore, it shifts into more of a greenish turquoise color. I learned that by observing carefully when I was in Jamaica, which has the most gorgeous green turquoise waters I've ever seen. So already I've shifted quite far from the reference photo, but that's okay. I'm just keeping in mind what my vision is, which is the brighter, more intense colors. In this case, because I've already shifted so far from the reference photo, I really have to think about how light acts in a landscape. So the sun is out, it's reflecting on the water, so we get a lot of that glimmer, almost like a glare. And the rocks themselves are also going to have brighter reflections. So if the rocks are wet, they'll reflect some bright blue, or the color of the rock is going to feel a little bit more intense. So I won't use quite so much pale brown or gray tones. And a lot of times, depending on the angle of the sun, you can see down into the water. So there's a bit less reflection close by. So I can see rocks and maybe even fish or whatever. And I can represent those things by simply dotting in a variety of colors. But when I mix complementary colors, it can potentially turn to mud. And I don't necessarily want that. So I just have to be a little bit careful with my placement. And at some point, I am not even looking at the reference photo anymore. If I needed a reference photo to begin with, I am mainly using it as an inspiration for light or how certain forms look, like the rocks themselves, or perspective or something like that. But once I get to a certain point in the painting, I just abandon it and I try to go from my own mind. And that is also a really tricky thing at first. So of course you can always use the reference photo completely through the whole session. And my advice is that when you're just starting out and you want to start applying your own colors to the landscape, just try it little by little. So maybe in one painting, you'll change one single color. In the next painting, you'll try to change 2 colors and so on. And since we're just practicing, you might as well experiment and just have fun with your colors and try things you might not ever try in a commission or anything. I personally think the easiest thing to change if you want to start down this path of using your own creative colors are the shadow tones. You can leave the rest of the painting more realistic or go off of what you see in the reference photo, but just change the shadow color. So choose a fun color like bright red or bright blue or something and see how that looks. You might be really surprised. It's a lot of fun and it can lead to some really cool results. Okay, so this wasn't a tutorial on how to paint coasts, but I have a ton of tutorials about that over on my Patreon and classes over on Skillshare, so you have plenty to choose from, and you can use my Skillshare link to get 2 weeks free if you want. But what I really want to know from you guys is, now that you've heard me talk through these things, what other questions do you have about color? I've received questions about how to choose colors, which is a very personal thing, and how to mix greens, which is a whole huge topic in itself. So I have more videos planned in the future, but if you throw your questions at me, I will collect them and try to answer them as best as I can. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.